Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is November of 2018. Today I'm going to be doing a review and discussion of the New York Times article by Barry Weiss called Meet the Renegades of the Intellectual Dark Web, subtitled An Alliance of Heretics is Making an End Run Around the Mainstream Conversation. Should we be listening? This will be the first of 4 entries where I will discuss how the mainstream is beginning to triangulate and target their new enemies list. Starting, of course, with the IDW, which they are making as sort of a group that is both potentially electrifying and interesting, but also somewhat dangerous because it links over into the AIN, which we will get to later. So the second part on this will be a report from the Data Society called Media Manipulation and Disinformation Online. The third part will be the alternative influence thing, also from the Data Society, called Broadcasting the Reactionary Right on YouTube. That's where the AIN comes in. And then part 4 is from the Atlantic Council, a report called Whose Truth, Sovereignty, Disinformation, and Winning the Battle of Trust. And that's where you really get to the heart of the whole matter, where they're talking about sovereignty, because it is all about the nation state and the power structure identifying us as the enemy. Now, in order to set the overall rubric for this, we don't actually have to go all the way back to COINTELPRO in order to understand and explain it. What we do need to look at, though, is Cass Sunstein, who was a Obama administration official. He's an anti-conspiracy theorist, and he rather infamously wrote an article along with Adrian Vermeule called Cognitive Infiltration. And later on camera, he went on to deny having ever written this article and having no recollection of writing it at all. He simply said, well, I had so many publications over the years, I'm not so sure if that's really one that I wrote or not. Now we can look here to Rational Wiki, always a reliable source, as Sunstein and Adrian Vermeule, to refer to the use of government and third-party cognitive provocateurs and front groups to infiltrate social networks, other online groups, and real-life groups built around conspiracy theories. And of course, they have expanded it far beyond simple conspiracy theories on into all of these other populist movements now. I think it's also notable to remember that Sunstein is married to another Obama administration official, Samantha Power. It's also important to understand that within academia, he is very highly thought of course, by the secular left that runs academia. He's one of the top 5 most cited legal scholars in the Western world. He's also written a book in 1995 called Democracy and the Problem of Free Speech. Note this, he is always all about trying to regulate people's thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors. In 2000, he co-wrote a book with Stephen Holmes called The Cost of Rights, Why Liberty Depends on Taxes. So, of course, I'm a libertarian. Libertarians' view on that is taxation is theft. And ultimately, his argument in the book is for the state to bestow upon you your rights, in order for the state to sort of acknowledge your rights or tacitly allow you to exercise them, they must steal from you first. Now, of course, the libertarian understanding of rights is very different. It is really the state is there if you allow it to exist at all in a minarchist fashion or whatever. The state is there merely to acknowledge rights that pre-exist. The state has no right whatsoever to bestow upon you whole sets of rights, because then they can make up new rights or regulate rights or shut rights down or change them and filter them off, which is ultimately what people like Sunstein want to happen. In 2005, he wrote a book called Radicals in Robes, Why Extreme Right-Wing Courts Are Wrong for America. And of course, I would say that there's really no such thing as extreme right-wing courts, but there are extreme left-wing courts, which he will not write a book about at all, nor even acknowledge that they exist. Obviously, here I'm thinking of the Ninth Circuit, to be sure. In 2009, he continued his obsession with manipulating what people are allowed to think and what they're not allowed to think or speak about. He wrote On Rumors, How Falsehoods Spread, Why We Believe Them, and What Can Be Done. And of course, he means what can government do with the threat of force through the barrel of a gun. In 2014, he wrote Valuing Life, Humanizing the Regulatory State. And you'll remember that Stephen Bannon famously said that the Trump administration is all about deconstructing the regulatory state, i.e. the regulatory state is really bad. It is the enemy of you. And people like Cass Sunstein want to support that. And of course, his cohorts at the New York Times and Washington Post also want to support that. And laughably, of course, in March of 2018, he put out, "Can It Happen Here? Authoritarianism in America." And I wonder why he would write something like that. So with all of that sort of setting the parameters for the understanding of the article that I'm about to get into and the other 3 articles after that in the succeeding episodes, I want you to pay really close attention to how Bari Weiss uses words in this and how she is using these words in order to encode particular emotional reactions, especially among the intellectual elites and the subscribers to the New York Times, primarily the people in New York City, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C., among the regulatory class. She begins here. "Here are some things that you will hear when you sit down to dinner with the vanguard of the intellectual dark web." And immediately she's used this word vanguard, which has connotations of both the extreme left and the extreme right. If you know anything about history, that is, those are where that's the place where you usually see that particular term used. "There are fundamental biological differences between men and women." Is she referring here to sexual dimorphism, or is she referring to something else? We're not real sure. This is just a bland, generalized statement, and we don't know exactly what is meant by that. "Free speech is under siege." She says this as if we're supposed to be surprised that people don't know this. "Identity politics is a toxic ideology that is tearing American society apart." Of course it is. "And we're in a dangerous place if these ideas are considered, quote, dark." She says, "I was meeting with Sam Harris, who is, of course, a recycled new atheist, in quotes, of the Four Horsemen group, a neuroscientist, Eric Weinstein, and I would just basically lump him into a group of sort of bland secular leftists, who's a mathematician and managing director of Thiel Capital." And over you'll see these very wealthy libertarians like Peter Thiel, who has lately associated with the Republican Party, but they're always easily duped by these secular leftists into thinking that they're somehow on their side when ultimately they are not. And maybe he just doesn't understand libertarian theory at all. That's probably it, I guess. The Koch brothers are very much in the same camp as him, as not really understanding what libertarianism is supposed to be about. The commentator and comedian Dave Rubin, I haven't listened to anything Dave's had on in probably 2 or 3 months. I don't know what's happening with the show, but it's just been not very interesting lately. And their spouses in a Los Angeles restaurant to talk about how they were turned into heretics. A decade ago, they argued, when Donald Trump was still hosting The Apprentice, none of these observations would have been considered taboo. And really, that is true for the broader social sphere, but if you're talking about within academia, such as the arts, humanities, and social sciences, it's been controversial for quite some time. Alan Bloom wrote about this way back in the 1980s with Closing of the American Mind, which I've done a presentation on here before, and Dinesh D'Souza wrote Illiberal Education, where he was talking about the same problems way back in the early 1990s. And almost all of these ideas are born out of either post-structuralism or postmodernism. You don't really have to know what that means right now to understand this, but it goes back within academia for quite some time, and it's only now seeping into the broader culture because it takes a while for it to be taken up by, say, journalists and Hollywood writers, to where they start getting the stuff into the television shows and the movies, and then everybody else essentially gets slowly brainwashed into thinking all of this stuff is correct over time. Skipping down a bit, what is the IDW and who is a member of it? It's hard to explain, which is both its beauty and its danger. Most simply, it is a collection of iconoclastic thinkers, academic renegades, and media personalities who are having a rolling conversation on podcasts, YouTube, and Twitter, and in sold-out auditoriums that sound unlike anything else happening, at least publicly, in the culture right now. Feeling largely locked out of legacy outlets. Feeling, is that really the appropriate word to use there? They are still, and have been for a long time, locked out of mainstream media outlets. They are rapidly building their own mass media channels. The closest thing to a phone book for the IDW is a sleek website that lists the dramatis personae of the network, including Mr. Harris, Mr. Weinstein and his brother and sister-in-law, the evolutionary biologist Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, Jordan Peterson, the psychologist and best-selling author, the conservative commentators Ben Shapiro and Douglas Murray, Maajid Nawaz, the former Islamist turned anti-extremist activist, and the feminist Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Christina Hoff Sommers. But in typical dark web fashion, no one knows who put up the website. I'm sure that could be found out quite easily. I would also like to point out that every person that she just listed here, save perhaps Christina Hoff Sommers and maybe Douglas Murray, they're all really milquetoast and sort of ephemeral epiphenomena of a much broader and deeper movement that's been going on for a really long time. They just happen to be those that have become most prominent of late. And when she lumps in Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Christina Hoff Sommers as feminists, this is a grab-all term. It doesn't differentiate between the different levels and forms of feminism that are currently in existence, So, like, first-wave feminism is basically women should have rights just like everyone else. They should be able to own property just like everyone else. They should also be able to vote and so on and so forth. Second-wave feminism is a little bit more radical in comparison to how things were before. And it's basically says women should be able to engage in executive lifestyles. They should be able to run businesses. They should be able to run for political office and all this sort of thing. Now, third wave feminism is when you start getting into this whole thing about how women need men like fish need a bicycle or something. Basically, it starts turning into this kind of genocidal eliminationist take on feminism, to where men are horrible, evil, bad. They're the enemy. Patriarchy is the worst thing that's ever happened in the history of the world. And basically, men need to be killed and boys need to be mistreated, all for the honor of feminism. And she continually makes these references to, the dark web or the deep web, but none of this stuff is actually deep web or dark web material. And really what that emotionally connotes is access to murderers, to assassins, to hitmen, to child predators, to kidnappers for hire, and all kinds of other horrible things that actually do take place on the deep web or the dark web, whichever you wish to call it. These people have nothing whatsoever to do with things like that at all. And all throughout the article, you have these pictures of the various members of the IDW who she talks to. They, at the same time, sort of appear sleek, but also a little bit ominous as well, which I think is the overall oeuvre that they're going for with this article. It continues here. The core members have little in common politically. Now, we'll question that rather rapidly. Brett and Eric Weinstein and Miss Heying were Bernie Sanders supporters, leftist. Mr. Harris was an outspoken Hillary voter, leftist. Ben Shapiro is an anti-Trump conservative. So what do we have there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 anti-Trumpers. But they have little in common politically. Interesting. And we'll skip down a bit here again. Quote, "People are starved for controversial opinions," said Joe Rogan, of course, a self-professed meathead. I love Joe Rogan. His stand-up comedy is quite hilarious. And I love to listen to his MMA commentary and all that sort of stuff, but in terms of being included in this IDW movement, I'm not real sure how that even takes place. And of course, Joe is in a really difficult position when it comes to all of this. He has to be able to satisfy people who are both on the left and the right, because if he threatens the left too much, they'll simply have his show ended, just like they did his friend Alex Jones. They'll take anything off the air that becomes basically too big, that it's unmanageable for them. I'll continue here. That hunger has translated into a booming and in many cases profitable market. So you see here the emotional connotation with this is IDW makes money, that's bad. New York Times tries to get money, that's really good. Episodes of The Joe Rogan Experience, which have featured many members of the IDW, can draw nearly as big an audience as Rachel Maddow. Ooh, Rachel Maddow. She gets, 2.3 million viewers per night or something, and is barely in, 17th position out of the top 18 spots, where Fox dominates absolutely everything in the top 20 right now. And really, over time, Joe's shows get many more millions of views than what they're talking about in this article, too. Of course, it all gets copied and replicated all over the place, and I guess they're just not smart enough to track any of that down and figure out that his shows are probably listened to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 million times per episode. Skipping down a bit more. But as the members of the intellectual dark web become genuinely popular, I don't actually even know what she means by that, they're also coming under more scrutiny. This is, of course, by the members of the regulatory state. On April 21st, Kanye West crystallized this problem. This problem. What does that mean? When he tweeted 7 words that set Twitter on fire. I love the way Candace Owens thinks. Oh my goodness, that's so dangerous, right? Candace Owens, the communications director for Turning Point USA, and of course she was not that when that happened, I don't believe, is a sharp young black conservative, a telegenic speaker with killer instincts. I don't know what killer instincts means there either. I know she's really fast with her speech and all that, a little bit like Ben Shapiro, who makes videos with titles like How to Escape the Democrat Plantation, good title, and The Left Thinks Black People Are Stupid, accurate title. Mr. West's praise for her was sandwiched inside a longer thread that referenced many of the markers of the intellectual dark web, like the tyranny of thought policing, that is a real problem, and the importance of independent thinking. Oh my goodness, you have to be kidding me. This is a marker of the intellectual dark web. I thought that independent thinking was something that was always supposed to be important to the left. Like I was on the left for 10 years or so, and that was always something that was supposed to be really important for all humans, right? Oh my goodness. He was photographed watching a Jordan Peterson video. Wow. I mean, don't be that risky, Kanye, right? All of a sudden, it seemed the IDW had broken through to the culture-making class. See, this is where the thread is. They don't like this at all because they want to be the determinants for this culture-making class. You know, they want their Stephen Colbert up there telling you what to think, Jimmy Kimmel crying and telling you what to think, and all this sort of stuff. And in a few, the group flirted with embracing Miss Owens as their own. Oh, you'd better watch out for that, you know. Yet Miss Owens is a passionate Trump supporter who has dismissed racism as a threat to black people. And I'm pretty sure she's never completely dismissed that notion. Anyway, many others in the IDW were made nervous by her sudden ascendance to the limelight, seeing Miss Owens not as a sincere intellectual, whatever that means. Remember, this article already included Joe, self-professed meathead Rogan, you know, the guy who sometimes teaches you stuff, although he hosted scare tactics, right, as he joked about in his stand-up comedy routine. But as a provocateur in the mold of Milo Yiannopoulos. For the IDW to succeed, they argue, it needs to eschew. And remember, Tom Woods, the best-selling libertarian author, in his advice to other authors, eschew, the use of the word eschew. Just like if you can use the word use rather than utilize, don't use utilize, please. Those interested in violating taboo for its own sake. Quote, I'm really only interested in building this intellectual movement, Eric Weinstein said. The IDW has bigger goals than anyone's buzz or celebrity. Now, this is what is called boundary policing, for those who don't know. And academics are notoriously highly territorial people. This is one of the bigger problems that's developed over the last century or so within academia, where it has become hyper-specialized, and anybody who goes over into these other specialized categories gets viciously attacked by others within academia about that particular subject or topic or whatever it happens to be. And I'm going to skip down here a bit in the article to the part where they're all sort of revealing how they became, the outcasts or enemies of the extreme far left, who are, basically the more dominant mold of the left right now. It says here, Sam Harris says his moment came in 2006 at a conference at the Salk Institute with Richard Dawkins, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and other prominent scientists. Of course, all secular leftists. Remember that? Mr. Harris said something that he thought was obvious on its face. Not all cultures are equally conducive to human flourishing. Some are superior to others. Yes, some cultures are better than others. Big shock. Quote, until that time I had been criticizing religion, so the people who hated what I had to say were mostly on the right. This was the first time I fully understood that I had an equivalent problem with the secular left. After his talk, in which he disparaged the Taliban, a biologist who would go on to serve on President Barack Obama's Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, surprise, surprise, approached him. I remember she said, that's just your opinion. See, relativism, subjectivism, so on, they love that kind of stuff. How can you say that forcing women, see, she even had it in her own statement, forcing women, but she wants you to think that forcing women here is good for that culture and really, really bad for other cultures. How can you say that forcing women to wear burqas is wrong? But to me, it's just obvious that forcing women to live their lives inside bags is wrong. Seems pretty obvious to me, too. I gave her another example. What if we found a culture that was ritually blinding every third child? And she actually said to me, it would depend on why they were doing it. His jaw, he said, actually fell open. And this is why I always say about the left on Twitter, without double standards, the left would actually have no standards at all. And I do mean, this more extreme group that seems to be actually running the left right now. And on the next page, they have a rather strange picture of Mr. Harris, sort of looks almost like a peeping Tom hiding out in the weeds or bushes or something like that. I have a printed off version of this, so it may not be exactly as your online version is. I'm not sure. I'm going to skip the next two portions about Jordan Peterson. It's too well documented to waste time on. Same for Ben Shapiro. But I'll move down to this next section. It says, other figures in the IDW, like Claire Lehman, the founder and editor of the online magazine Quillette. She's really fun to follow on Twitter, too, by the way. And Deborah So, who has a PhD in neuroscience, self-deported from the academic track, sensing that the spectrum of acceptable perspectives and even areas of research was narrowing. It's been going on for a long time. Dr. So said that she started, quote, waking up, in scare quotes, in the last 2 years of her doctorate program. She says, it was clear that the environment was inhospitable to conducting research. If you produce findings that the public doesn't like, you can lose your job. Well, it's not so much the public as it is what the mainstream media says is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. When she wrote an op-ed in 2015 titled, Why Transgender Kids Should Wait to Transition, citing research that found that a majority of gender dysphoric children outgrow their dysphoria, she said her colleagues warned her, even if you stay in academia and express this view, tenure won't protect you. This sounds more like a threat to me than anything else. But now think about this for a minute. Transgender kids. So this is like, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds deciding that they should be something else, right, than whatever they're biologically born as. Now, in our society, we've decided that we don't let children drive cars until, 15 or 16, with parental supervision and things like that. Or if they get a hardship license, they can drive maybe at 14 or 15 to a job. You also have regulations around when you can smoke and when you can buy alcohol, when you're able to vote and, things of that nature, right? But we also know from neuroscience that the human brain isn't fully formed, it isn't fully mature until approximately the age of 25. So some of these things that we allow people to do at young ages was because they were forced to when society was in much more difficult conditions than we are in now. But why would you allow 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds to make decisions like this that alter literally the rest of their life that cannot be undone? Okay, so maybe in the future, 30, 40, 50 years, they can undo, this process or whatever and go back, if this dysphoria phase passes for them or whatever else. But, we don't let kids drive till 16, but yet at 11, they know that they should be male when they're female or female when they're male, vice versa, and all this kind of stuff. What kind of nonsense is this? And you can't even raise this as a legitimate question within academia, or your entire career is put on the line? This is the height of absurdity, people. And I'll skip a section here where it goes back to Jordan Peterson once again, and then back to the Weinsteins and the Evergreen State situation. All that's been covered to death. So I'm going to go on to this other part where they talk about Michael Shermer here, who's, another one of these sort of new atheist types. He's a part of the skeptic community, that's always criticizing people who claim they've seen ghosts and stuff like that. So it says here, I've been at this for 25 years now, having done all of the MSM shows, including Oprah, Charlie Rose, The Colbert Report, Larry King, you name it. Michael Shermer, the publisher of Skeptic Magazine, told me, the last couple of years, I've shifted to doing shows hosted by Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin, Sam Harris, and others. The IDW is as powerful in media as any I've encountered. And it says here, listen to this very interesting way they demote Michael Shermer. It says, Mr. Shermer, a middle-aged science writer. A middle-aged science writer? Is that the right way to characterize him? Whenever he criticizes people who've seen, like a Bigfoot or a UFO or something like that, they always say, professor of Claremont University, but here he gets demoted to simply middle-aged science writer. I think that's rather comical. And then on the next page, they have a picture of Mr. Shermer basically like hiding out in some trees and looking extremely uncomfortable in a pair of I guess blue jeans and a sports jacket. And on the next page, the article continues in what will be the pivot towards the danger zone, which the other 3 articles that I will get to are really going to focus in on, such as the AIN network or whatever. So it says here, there are a few people in this network who have gone without saying anything critical about Trump, a person who has assaulted truth more than anyone in human history, Mr. Harris said. If you care about the truth, that is quite strange. But of course, he's speaking to the New York Times, which on a daily basis, of course, abuses truth far more than Trump ever could in his entire lifetime, and they do this on a daily and weekly basis. Emphasis is one problem, associating with genuinely bad people is another, so watch out, here come the bad guys, the scary ones, right? Go a click in one direction and the group is enhanced by intellectuals with Tony affiliations like Steven Pinker at Harvard, who of course never says anything too much controversial at all. But go a click in another and you'll find alt-right figures like Stefan Molyneux, who is, an anarcho-libertarian. He's not alt-right at all. He frequently tells you that he's not alt-right. And Milo Yiannopoulos, whose star has, of course, completely faded now. Almost no one even knows who he is anymore. And conspiracy theorists like Mike Cernovich. I mean, watch out for Cernovich. He's a very dangerous guy, right? It says the hashtag Pizzagate huckster, which I don't think he actually talked about Pizzagate very much at all, and he's totally moved on from that time. And Alex Jones, the Sandy Hook shooting denier. Of course, Alex has decried that many times. He said that he was just offering people a platform. He was actually being attacked quite frequently by his own listeners for not covering Sandy Hook enough in the way that they wanted him to cover it, So he apologized for it, and there's a big court case about it now. Who knows what the outcome of that's going to be. And this is where Barry Weiss really starts to get into the whole targeting thing, because it says here, it's hard to draw boundaries around an amorphous network, especially when each person in it has a different idea of who is beyond the pale. And of course, that's what will be traced out by the other articles that I'm going to get into later, is they want to really track down who are the super, super bad guys. And then they start making these really absurdist linkages between, each one. Well, so-and-so talked to so-and-so, therefore they are connected. But talking to other people doesn't really actually connect you to that person's ideology. It's total nonsense to make associations in that manner. So take note of this next section here when they're talking about, basically the boundary policing that I was talking about earlier. But is a statement of principles necessary to make a judgment call about people like Mr. Cernovich, Mr. Molyneux, and Mr. Yiannopoulos? Why even put the Mr. part there? Why don't you just call them some slur term, since that's really what you're thinking anyway and what you want your readers to hear as you write this and they read it? Mr. Rubin has hosted all 3 on his show, and he appeared on a typically unhinged episode of Mr. Jones's radio show, InfoWars. And again, of course, why don't you just call him a name? We know that's what you're thinking. Mr. Rogan regularly lets Abby Martin, and I completely, totally, utterly disagree with everything that she believes politically, but do I think that it's evil or wrong for Joe Rogan to interview her? I mean, how absurd is this? And that is literally the position that they're drawing out in this article. So it says, regularly lets Abby Martin, a former 9/11 truther, watch out for them. Remember Cass Sunstein? He was the guy who had cognitive infiltration as his idea for how to deal with 9/11 truthers, okay? But that idea has spread out all through the rest of these things, too. They want to regulate all movements, not just 9/11 truth movements in this fashion. Who is strangely sympathetic to the regimes of Syria and Venezuela. I think Venezuela basically pays her bills right now, from what I understand. She works for a TV station that is basically run by the Venezuelan government. Allows her to rant on his podcast. He also encouraged Mr. Jones to spout off about the moon landing being fake during Mr. Jones's nearly 4-hour appearance on his show. When asked why he hosts people like Mr. Jones, Mr. Rogan has insisted that he's not an interviewer or a journalist. I just talk to people and I record it. That's it. Well, okay, so 60 Minutes and Geraldo Rivera and all these people, they talk to, Charles Manson. I mean, I remember watching the interview with Geraldo Rivera where he interviewed Manson. Of course, he threatened to, fight him and beat him up and all this kind of stuff, but everybody else has been interviewed. I mean, long ago, Ahmadinejad was interviewed by Charlie Rose, and Charlie Rose famously now we know is running around behind the scenes not wearing any pants and things like that and trying to be abusive of women, and he ultimately lost his job because of that. So I mean, really, what are you talking about here in terms of who can interview who? How do you get to regulate who someone else gets to speak to? This is ludicrous. And she continues to hammer on this same point over and over, and I'll skip down here to another section. It says, but people who pride themselves on pursuing the truth and telling it plainly should be capable of applying these labels when they're deserved. It seems to me that if you're willing to sit across from an Alex Jones or Mike Cernovich, and remember, of course, Cernovich has been on 60 Minutes, Alex Jones has been interviewed on mainstream media all over the place, he was on CNN multiple times, MSNBC, so on and so forth, and also remember, she's writing for the New York Times that regularly interviews not just Donald Trump, but also Vladimir Putin and all of the other global leaders and all this kind of stuff, and she's saying that you can't talk to somebody like Mike Cernovich. She continues here, if there's a reason for shorting the IDW, it's the inability of certain members to see this as a fatal error. And of course, by fatal error, what they mean is the Washington Post and the New York Times and the intellectual elitists don't agree with you interviewing these people. They want that to be disallowed. They want to be able to block you from doing that. And finally, I'll move down towards the conclusion, where she says, I get the appeal of the IDW. I share the belief that our institutional gatekeepers need to crack the gates open much more. I don't, however, want to live in a culture where there are no gatekeepers at all. See, the New York Times has a very important role here. Given how influential this group is becoming, I can't be alone in hoping the IDW finds a way to eschew the cranks, grifters, and bigots and sticks to the truth-seeking. And basically, in regard to all of this, my own personal conclusion about it is that this New York Times article is intended to be exactly what Cass Sunstein wanted to happen. This is a form of the cognitive infiltration process. This is all about basically creating a filtration system to sort of siphon people off from a particular route of thinking about things that are considered to be dangerous by our intellectual elites who tell us what we can think and what we can't think. And I'll delve into this much deeper, when I get into part 2, 3, and 4, and we look at what the Data Society had to say and the Atlantic Council. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.